Hey everyone, ready to dive into something pretty thought-provoking? We're going deep on a research paper that kind of flips the script on how we think about existential risks from AI. You know those sci-fi movies where a super intelligent AI decides to just wipe out humanity?
Yeah, the classic decisive AI existential risk scenario,
Yeah.
often featuring a rogue AI, like that paperclip maximizer.
Right, exactly. But what if the real threat is not this big dramatic event, but more like a slow burn?
Yeah.
That's the question that two types of AI existential risk, decisive and accumulative, by Tusa Kasirzada, tries to answer. So instead of one all-powerful AI calling the shots, imagine a bunch of smaller AI-driven disruptions across our economy, politics, you name it. Kind of like climate change in a way.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. The paper actually takes a systems analysis approach, which you don't really see very often in AI risk research.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so the paper argues that these seemingly isolated AI disruptions can actually interact and amplify each other, gradually weakening our systems until they just, well, break down.
So instead of worrying about one big bad AI, we should be looking at the whole system and how AI is changing it piece by piece.
Exactly. Think of it like a delicate ecosystem. Even like small changes in one part of the system can ripple out and eventually lead to a collapse of the whole thing. And that's the essence of the accumulative AI existential risk hypothesis.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this is a whole new way of thinking about AI risk, but help me connect the dots. How does the systems thinking apply to AI specifically?
Well, the paper focuses on three critical subsystems: economic, political, and military.
Okay.
And these are all like interconnected. So like a disruption in one can easily trigger problems in the others.
Makes sense, like a domino effect. One domino falls and triggers a whole chain reaction.
Exactly. For example, imagine AI-driven automation leading to mass unemployment. That could then lead to economic instability, which in turn fuels political unrest, maybe even escalating into military conflict.
Okay, so we've got these three interconnected systems, economic, political, and military, and we're seeing AI disruptions popping up within each of them. But how does this actually lead to an existential threat? What's the end game look like?
Well, the paper lays out this thought experiment called the Mister scenario. It's basically a what-if story about how seemingly isolated AI disruptions could create a perfect storm of global catastrophe.
Wait, Mr. scenario. As in a friendly gentleman, this is starting to sound kind of ominous.
Yeah, not quite a friendly gentleman.
Hmm?
Mister is actually an acronym, and each letter stands for a different cluster of social risks that AI poses. These risks might seem like just everyday problems on their own, but the paper argues that they can combine and escalate in pretty dangerous ways.
Okay, break it down for me. What does Mr. stand for, and how do these risks play out in this doomsday scenario?
Okay, so imagine a world where AI is like super integrated into every aspect of our lives. Cities run on AI. Our decisions are guided by personalized AI assistants. Even our toasters are collecting data thanks
Hmm.
to the Internet of Things. But then things start to go wrong.
Okay, I'm getting some serious Black Mirror vibes here. What's the first domino to fall in this Mr. scenario?
The M stands for manipulation. So imagine AI-powered deepfakes and misinformation campaigns so sophisticated, it's basically impossible to tell what's real and what's fake anymore. Trust in information in institutions and even in each other completely breaks down. Like, it's an information apocalypse.
Yeah, I can see that happening. Deepfake tech is getting crazy good. It's already tough to tell what's real online. So what's next in the Mr. scenario?
The I stands for insecurity threats. Think AI-powered cyber attacks that cripple critical infrastructure, like power grids, financial systems across multiple continents. The lights go out, economies crash, and society descends into chaos.
Okay, so we've got manipulation sowing discord and then insecurity threats causing widespread panic. What about surveillance? What role does that play?
Well, the S stands for surveillance and erosion of trust. In this chaotic world, governments and corporations turn to AI-powered surveillance to try to regain some control. But this just amplifies the feeling of being watched, like Big Brother, leading to more distrust and paranoia.
So not only are the lights out and the economy is tanking, but you've got AI watching your every move. This is starting to feel like a dystopian nightmare.
And it gets worse. The T and E in Mister stand for technological and economic destabilization. Those blackouts and cyber attacks trigger a global economic meltdown. We're talking mass unemployment because of automation, wealth inequality amplified by AI, and the whole global trade network just collapses. It's a full-blown systemic breakdown.
So manipulation leads to insecurity, which leads to surveillance, which then triggers economic collapse. It's like a chain reaction of bad news. What's the final nail in the coffin? What does R stand for?
R is for rights infringement. In this chaotic world, basic human rights are basically trampled in the name of security. AI-powered surveillance becomes even more invasive, eroding privacy, freedom of expression, and leading to, discriminatory profiling everywhere. It's a world where survival trumps freedom, you know?
So to recap, the Mr. scenario paints a terrifying picture of how all these AI risks can converge to create this perfect storm of global catastrophe. We've got manipulation, insecurity threats, surveillance, economic collapse, and human rights violations, all fueled by the spread of AI. It's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, it is. And we're just scratching the surface here. The paper also compares how the decisive and accumulative pathways to existential risk actually play out and what that means for governing AI in the future. But that's a conversation for next time.
This is heavy stuff, but I'm also feeling a sense of urgency. If this accumulative risk idea is right, we need to start taking those smaller AI problems a lot more seriously. They might not seem like existential threats on their own, but together they could be like the fuse that lights the fire.
Yeah, I think that's a really crucial point. The accumulative perspective makes us think about AI risk in a more holistic and nuanced way. It's not just about stopping one super AI. It's about understanding how the whole AI ecosystem is evolving and what we can do to prevent these smaller risks from becoming catastrophic.
This has been a lot to process, but I'm really glad we're having this conversation.
Me too.
And we'll pick it back up in the next part of our deep dive. See you then.
See ya.
Welcome back. Last time we were talking about that pretty unsettling thought experiment, the Mr. scenario, the one where all those AI risks kind of spiral out of control.
Yeah, pretty stark picture. But it really shows the difference between those two types of AI risk we've been exploring, the decisive versus the accumulative.
Right, and I think we need to unpack those differences a bit more. You mentioned the decisive pathway is the one we're more used to seeing. That's the classic evil AI takes over the world plotline, right?
Exactly. The decisive scenario basically involves a single superintelligent AI, something like that paperclip maximizer, It rapidly gains control over everything and just triggers this swift collapse. It's super sudden, almost like a lightning strike.
Okay, so it's like one single point of failure, one powerful AI that throws everything out of whack, but the accumulative pathway is more complex.
Yeah, way more complex. In the accumulative scenario, you don't have this, single bad guy AI calling the shots. Instead, there are multiple AI systems all causing these disruptions, seemingly isolated, across all those interconnected systems we talked about, economic, political, military.
So more like a bunch of small fires that eventually combine into a massive wildfire.
Perfect analogy. These smaller disruptions might start in different places and seem totally unrelated at first, but over time they interact and amplify each other. It's like a domino effect. One domino falls, and then the whole structure collapses.
I see. So the accumulative view is actually way more complex than just worrying about one rogue AI. It's about understanding how all these different AIs are impacting these massive systems that keep society running. It's kind of like trying to predict the weather, right? So many variables.
Exactly. And that complexity makes it much harder to, predict and control. It's not about stopping one big event. It's about managing this whole web of risks that are constantly evolving.
I remember the paper had some visuals that illustrated these different pathways. I think they were figures 2 and 3. Could you walk me through those? Might help me wrap my head around all this.
Absolutely. Figure 2 shows that decisive pathway with one powerful AI directly impacting all those interconnected subsystems.
Okay, and it's like a chain reaction. One system weakens the next, and then the whole thing collapses, just like that power grid example.
Right. Now, figure 3 shows the accumulative pathway. It's way more intricate. Instead of squares, you see these clusters of problems, all interconnected, represented by hexagons. Each hexagon is one of those Mr. risks.
So within each hexagon, there are all these entities, people, institutions, communities, all interacting with different AIs and creating these little disruptions. Like those Mr. risks are bubbling up within each hexagon. But the hexagons aren't isolated, right?
Right. That's the point. All those hexagons, all those clusters are interconnected. And the disruptions they cause can ripple outwards and eventually impact those bigger systems, which are represented by those red diamonds in the diagram. So it's not one AI causing the problem, it's the complex interplay of multiple AIs and their ripple effects.
Okay, so it's this web of interconnected problems that are constantly feeding into each other. And as they grow, the web gets more and more fragile.
Exactly. The paper says this process slowly erodes the resilience of the whole system, making it more vulnerable to shocks. We get pushed closer and closer to a tipping point where even a small trigger could cause a total collapse. It's the gradual weakening of the system over time.
This is starting to feel less like a sci-fi movie and more like a real problem, a really complex one that we need to deal with now. I imagine some people push back against this whole accumulative risk idea.
Yeah, the paper actually addresses a couple of objections. One argument is that civilizations have collapsed before and humans have always bounced back, so why is this time any different?
Yeah, history is full of empires rising and falling. So, what's the counter argument? Why should we be more worried about an AI-driven collapse?
Well, the paper argues that our civilization now is way more interconnected than anything in the past. Think how fast that COVID pandemic, which was a health crisis, became a global economic crisis. We are all connected in ways we've never been before.
Yeah, COVID was a stark reminder of how fragile things are. So if one system collapses, like the financial system, that could trigger a cascade of failures across the whole world, like a house of cards.
Exactly. That level of interconnectedness makes us super susceptible to the kind of collapse that this accumulative risk idea describes. And that leads to the second objection, which is that the accumulative model is just too complex to be useful. How can we possibly track and predict the combined effects of all these AIs?
Yeah, if we can't even measure the risk, how can we manage it? It's like trying to predict the exact path of a hurricane.
The paper acknowledges that complexity, but says it's not a reason to just give up. Instead, it's a call to action to develop more sophisticated monitoring systems.
So instead of trying to predict the unpredictable, we need to build systems that can detect early warning signs. Kind of like those buoys in the ocean that track hurricanes.
Exactly. We need to track not just individual AI incidents, but their cumulative effects, how they interact across systems. We need to see the patterns that might not be obvious at first glance.
So it's like having a network of sensors that pick up on subtle changes in the AI ecosystem and warn us before problems spiral out of control.
Right. The paper argues those kinds of systems are essential if we want to manage these risks effectively. We need to be proactive, not reactive.
Makes sense. If we're dealing with this slow-burning threat, we need to spot the smoke before the whole house catches fire. So how does all of this change how we think about governing AI? Do we need to completely overhaul our approach?
It definitely calls for a shift in focus. The traditional approach has been about controlling superintelligent AI, like preventing the creation of some AI bomb.
Right, like nuclear non-proliferation for AI. But this accumulative risk idea suggests we need a different approach.
Exactly. Less about central control, more about distributed monitoring and early intervention. It's about making the systems themselves more resilient, building in safeguards, rather than trying to control every single AI out there.
So instead of trying to contain some AI monster, we need to make the AI ecosystem itself more robust. We need to design systems that adapt and evolve rather than break down.
Precisely. That means a more holistic approach to AI governance, one that considers all these interconnections and the potential for seemingly small problems to have huge consequences. We need to stop thinking about AI in isolation.
Okay, so we need a fundamental shift in how we think about AI safety. Does the paper give us any specific ideas about what this new approach to governance might look like? How do we actually build a more resilient AI ecosystem?
The paper lays out a multi-pronged strategy. First, we need those sophisticated monitoring systems that can track risk across different domains. They can warn us about potential problems early on.
So we need the AI equivalent of financial regulators who monitor the global economy and look for signs of a crisis. But instead of financial transactions, we're tracking AI and its impact.
That's a great analogy. We need to be thinking about AI governance in a similar way. It's not just about regulating individual AIs, it's about understanding their impact on the systems they operate in and preventing those impacts from becoming catastrophic.
Okay, so that's monitoring. What else?
We also need more adaptable regulatory frameworks. AI changes so fast, so our regulations have to be flexible. We can't just set rules and assume they'll work 5 or 10 years down the line.
It's not about setting rules in stone, but about creating a system that learns and adapts along with AI.
Precisely. And finally, we need international cooperation. AI is a global issue, so we need global solutions. No single country can handle this alone.
It's like climate change, right? No one country can solve it alone. We need to work together to address these risks, share information, and develop common standards.
Exactly. AI governance needs to be a collective effort. We need to work together to build a safe and sustainable AI future.
Okay, this whole accumulative risk idea is a real game changer. It forces us to move beyond that simple rogue AI story and face the real complex issue of how AI is changing the world. It's not just about controlling the tech, it's about understanding how it's changing society.
You got it. That's one of the most important points the paper makes. It's a call to action for all of us to look beyond the simple stories and engage with the real complexities of AI risk.
This has been a lot to take in, but really insightful. It's made me completely rethink how I view AI, but I think we're not quite done yet, right?
Right. We still need to talk about this idea of unifying social and existential risks. We've touched on it, but it deserves its own deep dive.
Totally agree. We've talked about these everyday risks like bias and surveillance, but haven't fully explored how they connect to those larger existential threats. I'm ready to dive in.
Let's do it. We'll tackle that in the final part of our deep dive.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive. We've covered so much ground from that Mr. scenario to talking about how to govern this constantly evolving AI landscape.
And now we get to dig into a concept that's been kind of woven through this whole conversation. Unifying social and existential risks in the context of AI. It's a key takeaway from the paper and has huge implications for how we think about AI safety.
You're right. It feels like we've been circling around it. We've talked about those like everyday AI problems like bias and misinformation and those big existential threats like the Mr. scenario. But we haven't really connected those two yet.
Yeah, we often treat them as separate things, almost like two different species of AI risk. We think of social risks as just annoyances, problems we can solve with regulation or better design. But those existential risks, those are like the monsters under the bed, the ones that could end humanity.
So it's like we're trying to swat away mosquitoes while ignoring a hurricane.
It's exactly. And that approach misses the connection between them. The paper argues that separating social and existential risks is a dangerous oversimplification.
And that's where that accumulative perspective comes in, right? Showing how those small everyday risks can build up and become something much bigger, much more dangerous, maybe even an existential threat.
Right, like ignoring a small crack in a bridge because you're worried about an earthquake. The crack might seem tiny, but it weakens the bridge and makes it way more likely to collapse, even without the earthquake.
So those smaller AI risks, like the biased algorithms, the surveillance, those are like cracks in the foundation of society. If we don't fix them, they can make us much more vulnerable to those big existential threats.
Exactly. It's not just about stopping some super intelligent AI. It's about addressing those smaller problems that can make society weaker and create the conditions for a huge collapse. AI safety isn't just about controlling powerful AI. It's about building a responsible AI ecosystem.
Okay, so this unified perspective on AI risk changes things. It's not about fighting two separate battles. It's about seeing the bigger picture and how all these risks are connected. What would that kind of approach look like in practice? What does it mean for AI research and governance?
It means we need to break down those walls between people researching social risks and those focused on existential risks. We need researchers and policymakers talking to each other, sharing ideas, and working on strategies that address the full spectrum of AI risks, from the small stuff to the potentially catastrophic stuff.
So instead of separate teams working on social risk and existential risk, we need to bring everyone together. We need to create a much more collaborative approach to AI safety.
Exactly. Imagine a world where AI researchers are constantly talking to ethicists, social scientists, and policymakers as they develop new algorithms. Imagine we're not just focused on building more powerful AI, but also AI that is aligned with our values, that promotes fairness and strengthens society instead of tearing it apart.
So instead of reacting to problems, we're trying to anticipate them and build systems that are more resilient.
Exactly. It's about changing our mindset from control and contain to design and build. We need to think about safety from the very beginning, including ethical considerations and social impact assessments in every stage of AI development.
This whole deep dive has been really eye-opening. We've moved from that idea of a super AI taking over to this much more subtle accumulative approach. And now we see how all those smaller AI risks could actually be the cracks in the foundation that lead to a much bigger collapse. It's a much more complex problem, but also a much more urgent one.
It is, and it requires a different way of thinking about AI safety, one that embraces complexity and moves beyond simple narratives. We need to remember that AI isn't some force outside of us. It's something we're creating and integrating into our lives. And the choices we make today will determine what the future with AI looks like.
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that this isn't some theoretical problem for future generations. This is happening now. The decisions we make about AI today, how we develop and use it, will have consequences for years to come. Those consequences could either lead to a better future or to a catastrophic collapse.
And those decisions aren't just made by tech companies or governments. They're made by researchers, engineers, investors, and consumers. All of us.
Right.
We all have a role to play in shaping the future of AI.
So for you listening, this means we all have a responsibility to engage in these conversations, to demand transparency and accountability from those building AI, and to push for a more ethical and sustainable approach to AI development. We can't just hope for the best. We need to actively shape the future we want to see.
We've got a lot to think about. This whole discussion has been a call to action for all of us to learn more, get involved, and demand better from those who are shaping the future of AI.
And that's it for our deep dive. We've explored a new perspective on AI risk, one that really challenges us to think deeply about how interconnected our world is and what our choices about technology might lead to. Remember, the future of AI isn't set in stone. It's something we're building together, so let's build wisely.